As we explained previously, competition is the main theme of life if a person wants to live on the face of this earth, because in most cases he's an individual who does not accept the differences of others from him in shape, skin color, or thought. Plus, he's afraid of the fluctuations of nature and anxious about the scarcity of its resources. And because Nation A does not accept Nation B's differences from it in terms of traditions, ideology, and behaviors, with the lack of trust between them, A and B must compete in order to achieve survival on the international stage, which is the first goal that politicians focus on in most countries of the world. We know that all nations have their own political system that regulates the internal affairs of its individuals, such as economic growth and internal security from, say, theft and raid, and its external affairs, such as diplomacy and establishment of alliances with other countries in order to achieve security, which in turn leads to survival. Since the dawn of history, several styles of political rule have emerged in terms of style, such as monarchical rule, democratic rule, the military rule, and etc. But in terms of content, there are only two types of government: the liberal system and the authoritarian system. It is a political system based on reducing individual freedoms and pluralism in a nation's society, while uniting its members under one particular thought and lifestyle, using rewards and intimidation to ensure security. Authoritarian regimes believe that absolute freedom brings complete chaos, and the existence of multiple opinions, lifestyles, and political orientations in one society leads to armed conflict between different members of the nation's society, and consequently, it becomes difficult to unite them under a specific political or social ideology if their individual freedoms are not erased and pluralism is not undermined. The authoritarian system brings together all governmental powers in order to increase control over its society. It attempts to control the legislative branch in order to pass the laws that suit it, and tries to control the executive and judicial branches in order to enforce those laws on citizens of society who are considered a threat to the regime. Society under authoritarian system is monitored to the opinions, ideologies, and political orientations that suit the ruling regime, either through soft methods such as indoctrinating children and rewarding people with privileges, or through brutal methods such as arresting citizens who oppose the ruling regime's ideology, torturing them, or executing them. The freedom of society to choose its ruler, ideology, and political orientations is suppressed by the authoritarian system, where the ruler is forcefully imposed on the society he rules, either through military coups or holding theatrical elections that resemble a Disney comic play. The authoritarian regime controls almost completely the economic field of a nation in order to extend its influence over society and enrich the regime members, including the president, the ministers, and leaders of the armed forces, since money is an element of power, as it controls production, consumption, foreign trade, and what is related to the nation's exports and imports by imposing arbitrary, bureaucratic measures on citizens of society, which in turn leads to enriching the regime's members and associates through bribery, self-dealing, embezzlement, fraud, and extortion. Consequently, members of society feel like they have no choice but to pay bribes and submit to extortion in order to overcome the bureaucratic obstacles that hinder the activity of their private companies in their economic dealings. The authoritarian regime suppresses freedom of expression by controlling the newspapers and mass media through censorship and imprisoning journalists who express opposing opinions to those of the regime, and also by erasing society's methods of expression, such as prohibiting protests, banning debates on college campuses, and physically harm anyone who participate in these practices. It is a political system based on respecting individual freedoms and encouraging pluralism in a nation's society. Liberal regimes believe that people are different in nature, and each of them has a special outlook on life, and cannot be unified under one specific way of living, ideology, or one specific philosophy of life, and also recognize that excessive restriction of individual freedom brings rebellion and generates armed conflict between society and the oppressive authoritarian regime. And as a result of that, liberal regimes see that the best solution to avoid these conflicts is to recognize and respect the individual freedoms of the nation's society and not reduce or suppress them, while embracing tolerance between members of society who differ in ideology and ways of life. This in turn creates pluralism in the social and political orientations that the liberal system encourages. Liberal regimes believe that the government's primary role is only limited to ensuring security among members of society with different orientations and ideologies in order to avoid violence and the occurrence of armed conflicts between them, and protecting those citizens from external aggression from other nations. Also, they believe that governments must not interfere in society's economic affairs, such as regulating markets of goods and services or capping their prices, and to not interfere in society's private affairs, such as marriage, entertainment, and traditions. The separation of power between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches is one of the basic principles of the liberal system, in order to restrict the role and work of the government so that each specific branch can focus on its assigned task, which leads to perfecting it. If influential members of the government's regime combine all three powers under their hands, the possibility of them turning into tyrants would become great, and thus all individual freedoms will be undermined, and society would be subjected to their personal desires through oppression and force. The liberal system recognizes the right of the nation's members to determine their political fate and choose their rulers based on their convictions, and the liberal regime's members and cabinet cannot interfere in the elections to steer it in favor of their personal desires. The liberal regime recognizes the right of the nation's citizens to make economic decisions based on their capabilities and resources. It does not interfere in regulating the economy or markets, except in tough times, such as the 2008 financial crisis. The liberal system guarantees individuals the freedom to express their opinions without fear, provided that they do not incite to commit acts of violence or sabotage, and guarantees the media the freedom to cover any topic they wish, even if it criticizes the regime's shortcomings. In most cases, the regime's systematic oversight is not exercised over the work of universities and opinions of academic professors and students. The liberal system recognizes the impossibility of uniting the nation's members under one ideology or lifestyle. Therefore, instead of focusing on the use of overwhelming force to suppress different opinions, liberal regimes focus on encouraging tolerance among the nation's citizens who have diverse ideas and orientations, and perhaps even different religious doctrines, in order to create pluralism and avoid conflicts. Also, liberal regimes believe that using force is restricted only to prevent violence between the different political orientations factions in the society. The authoritarian regime is characterized by being quick to make decisions related to the fate of the nation due to its gathering of all the branch powers under its hands, in addition to the absence of strong opposition to those decisions as a result of suppressing pluralism and intimidating any opinion that differs from the opinion of the regime. Countries governed by authoritarian regimes are known to be very difficult to penetrate their governmental, social, and security systems as a result of the suppression of individual freedoms, which leads to the reduction of freedom of movement, communication, and assembly, which are the basics of intelligence and spy work. In most cases, the authoritarian regime does not have mechanisms for a peaceful transition of power in case of the ruler's death or society's dissatisfaction with his performance. Due to his clinging to power through force and oppression at the expense of the nation's well-being, and his failure to accept the necessity of stepping down and relinquishing leadership. Therefore, the marginalized party, or the party most deserving of leadership, sees war as the one and only mean to remove individuals who do not want to give up the throne. The suppression of the freedom to make economic decisions by authoritarian regimes results in the creation of monopolistic markets and the reduction of competition between various producers and economic operators, which in turn leads to a slow economic growth and eventually the failure to develop enormous wealth that contributes to the prosperity of the nation's society. Markets that witness commercial competition encourage companies to produce goods in a large scale, not in order to win the love of consumers, but rather to overcome other competitors and gain large shares in the market, which in turn leads to more productivity and eventually more wealth for the nation. However, companies located in monopolistic markets do not see any incentive to increase production because they are not afraid of any competition. The liberal system has peaceful mechanisms for transferring power in case of the ruler's death, removal, or end of his term of office through holding fair and free elections, with all individuals from the losing political parties and orientations accepting the results and the new ruler, even if he or she was not their personal choice. The peaceful transfer of power creates stability in the government work. One of the greatest strengths of the liberal system is its excellent ability to create significant economic growth, which in turn grows the nation's wealth by a large percentage due to the non-intervention of the government or regime in restricting economic freedom and leaving the market's regulation to the law of supply and demand. As we explained previously, this leads to competition between producers, which results in higher rates of production of goods and services. The presence of pluralism in political opinions and orientations makes it difficult for the regime to make quick decisions, especially in cases of major crises such as wars, economic recessions, and natural disasters. The most prominent example in what happened in January 2024 in the United States of America, which adopts the liberal system in domestic politics, where the U.S. Congress failed more than once to pass a law that gives financial aid to Ukraine, which is currently at war with Russia, because some representatives did not accept giving money at the expense of the American people's needs, with some of them supporting a Russian victory in the war. This failure created fears among the American political elite about Ukraine's loss of the war and a possible submission to the Russian conditions and Vladimir Putin, which is a painful blow to American interests in Europe. In contrast to the authoritarian regime, with the growth of individual freedoms, it becomes difficult for the government that adopts the liberal system to fight foreign nations spying on its civil and military systems, secrets, and infrastructure. Suppressing the freedom of individuals greatly facilitates confronting foreign spies emerging from embassies and consulates. The higher the levels of education and employment of society's members, the lower they depend on government's regime to satisfy their needs, because they are satisfying them independently through their jobs and professions, and don't need government institutions for that, and vice versa. If people's dependence on the government increases, then regimes' control over those individuals would in turn increase and would realize that citizens wouldn't be able to oppose it, in case of any disagreements, because it can threaten them every time with withholding the government assistance with their needs from food to medicine, housing, and etc. Thus, the government regime would become more authoritarian and vice versa. In other words, the extent to which leaders of the armed forces, which are a substantial element of the regime, can meddle in the government's decision-making. The military institution is known to possess an authoritarian nature due to its carrying of the coercive means, such as weapons, in addition to training its members into obeying orders and to not question them. Therefore, the more we find military intervention in the government's decision-making in the subjects of economy, healthcare, agriculture, and etc., consequently, the more the regime of that government would turn into an authoritarian one, and the more the military distance itself from politics and government decision-making, the more likely the regime would become a liberal one. Whenever a particular nation who existed for thousands of years, such as China or Egypt, becomes accustomed to a certain political system of government, it would increasingly be difficult for that nation to change into another political system or regime of government. As we say the old quote, "Old habits die hard." Politicians realize that both authoritarian and liberal values have strengths and weaknesses, and in reality, most of the world's current regimes are not completely authoritarian or liberal. They are considered hybrid regimes that take from each system's playbook the principles and features that suit them in order to survive on the international stage. However, we also find that each regime in the world has inclinations either towards authoritarian values or liberal values. For example, the political regime in the United States of America is a hybrid one. It adopted and still adopts liberal practices such as the respect for individual freedoms, like freedom to protest, freedom to choose a ruler without any interference of authority, and economic freedom. On the other hand, it adopted authoritarian practices in the past, as it used to ban women their right to vote and used to prohibit white citizens from marrying black ones. Nowadays, we find that some authoritarian practices are still adopted, such as violating international law in 2003, when the US government did not obtain UN Security Council's approval to invade Iraq. But nevertheless, we must say that the American political regime is a hybrid one, but leans greatly towards liberal practices. To give another example, we find that the political regime in the People's Republic of China is also hybrid, as it adopts liberal characteristics such as respecting the freedom of its citizens to make economic decisions and limiting government intervention in specific sectors of its economy. On the other hand, it also adopts authoritarian practices, such as cracking down protests and forbidding other political parties than the CCP from achieving power. In the end, we must assume that the Chinese political regime is a hybrid one, but leans greatly towards authoritarian practices.